This wasn't a random interview, and the moment the Cleveland Browns announced they were sitting down with Grant Udinski, it quietly confirmed something a lot of fans have been suspecting for weeks. Cleveland isn't just looking for a head coach. They're choosing a direction. On the surface, this looks like another name added to a long interview list, but when you dig deeper, the details don't feel accidental. Udinski is young, he's offensive-minded. He's known for energy, adaptability, and quarterback-focused systems. And in today's NFL, those traits usually point to one thing: development over control. That's why this move instantly set off alarms across Browns circles. For years, Cleveland has been criticized for recycling the same type of coaches: older, rigid, scheme-first instead of player-first. This interview breaks that pattern, and when a franchise breaks pattern, it usually means something behind the scenes has already changed. Fans quickly connected the dots to Shedeur Sanders. There's been a lot of buzz online suggesting this interview isn't really about Udinski alone. It's about what kind of environment Cleveland wants to build moving forward. An environment where a young quarterback grows with his coach instead of being forced to adapt to someone else's outdated blueprint. Nothing about that has been confirmed, but the timing makes the speculation impossible to ignore. Especially when you remember how much attention Cleveland has already put on offense this offseason. This isn't a franchise searching for stability, it's a franchise searching for alignment. And alignment starts with coaching philosophy. The Browns didn't call in a safe, familiar name. They didn't bring in a legacy coach looking for one last run. They chose someone who represents upside and risk. And risk usually means belief. The real question isn't whether Grant Udinski gets the job. The real question is why Cleveland wants someone like him now. Because when an organization shows you what it's prioritizing, you should believe it. And if this interview is a signal, not a coincidence, then the Browns may have already made the most important decision of their offseason before hearing anyone at all. At first glance, this might look like just another name added to the interview list. But the moment the Cleveland Browns announced they were interviewing Grant Udinski, the move carried a lot more weight than it seemed on the surface. This interview matters because it breaks a pattern. For years, Cleveland has leaned toward familiar, established coaching profiles, experienced names, traditional structures, and systems that prioritize control and continuity. Udinski represents the opposite. He's young, he's modern, and he comes from an offensive background built around adaptability and quarterback development. That alone signals a philosophical shift. Udinski isn't being interviewed because of a long resume filled with head coaching stops. He's being interviewed because of trajectory. Teams don't bring in 30-year-old offensive coordinators unless they believe the upside outweighs the risk. And in today's NFL, that kind of upside is almost always tied to one thing: the quarterback. That's what makes this interview feel intentional instead of exploratory. Cleveland isn't just evaluating Udinski's play designs or his weekly game plans. They're evaluating how he thinks about offense, how he communicates, and how he builds systems around young talent. Those are traits organizations prioritize when they believe their future depends on development, not just execution. It's also important to look at who Cleveland didn't prioritize. The Browns could have leaned into the safer route: veteran coaches with decades of experience and rigid identities. Instead, they're spending time with someone who represents growth, flexibility, and evolution. That tells you the front office isn't just trying to stabilize, they're trying to modernize. Fans immediately picked up on that message. Online reaction wasn't about Udinski's win-loss record, it was about what he symbolizes: a break from recycled coaching cycles, a move away from "this is how we've always done it." And for a franchise that's struggled with offensive identity, that symbolism matters. None of this guarantees Udinski gets the job, and none of it proves Cleveland has made up its mind. But interviews at this level aren't random, they're filters. And by choosing to filter for youth, offensive innovation, and quarterback-friendly systems, the Browns revealed what they value most right now. That's why this interview matters. It's not about one candidate. It's about the direction Cleveland is finally willing to explore, even if it means stepping into unfamiliar territory. And once you recognize that, the next question becomes unavoidable. Who exactly is this new direction being built for? This interview isn't happening in a vacuum. Across the NFL, there's been a quiet but undeniable shift. teams are moving away from recycled leadership and leaning into youth, innovation, and adaptability. And by interviewing Grant Udinsky, the Cleveland Browns are signaling that they want in on that movement. For years, the default approach was experience over imagination. Older coaches, established systems, my way or the highway philosophies, but the league has changed. Defenses are faster, schemes evolve weekly, and offenses that thrive are built around flexibility, not rigidity. That's where younger offensive minds have gained real leverage. Udinsky fits that profile perfectly. At just 30 years old, he represents a generation of coaches who grew up studying spread concepts, RPOs, and quarterback-friendly systems. Coaches like this aren't trying to impose an identity, they're trying to build one around the players they have. And that's exactly why teams are taking chances on younger candidates earlier than ever before. This isn't about age for the sake of age, it's about mindset. Young offensive coaches tend to collaborate more, they adapt faster, they're less tied to outdated beliefs about how an offense should look. And most importantly, they're usually hired when an organization believes its future depends on development rather than discipline alone. That's the signal Cleveland is sending. The Browns could have filled their interview slate with familiar veteran names and played it safe. Instead, they're exploring candidates who represent growth and evolution. That tells you the front office isn't just reacting to last season, they're planning for the next several years. Fans immediately noticed this shift. Online discussion quickly moved past Udinsky's resume and focused on what his age represents. A coach who can grow with the roster, a coach who isn't locked into past successes, a coach whose career trajectory could align with a young core instead of clashing with it. To be clear, none of this guarantees success. Hearing young coaches always comes with risk. Less experience, fewer answers when things go wrong, but organizations don't embrace that risk unless they believe the upside is worth it. And in Cleveland's case, the upside appears to be alignment. Alignment between scheme and talent, alignment between coaching philosophy and player development, and alignment between where the league is headed, not where it's been. This interview doesn't confirm Cleveland's next hire, but it does confirm Cleveland's thinking. They're no longer chasing stability for stability's sake, they're chasing adaptability. And when a franchise starts valuing adaptability over comfort, it's usually because they believe the next phase of their identity is still being written, not inherited. Which makes the youth movement signal impossible to ignore. This is where the interview with Grant Udinsky stops being just a coaching storyline and starts looking like a quarterback statement. Because whether Cleveland says it publicly or not, moves like this are usually made with one position in mind, and that position is quarterback. For many fans, this interview immediately connected back to Shedeur Sanders. There's been growing conversation all offseason about whether Cleveland is truly ready to commit to him, not with words, not with press conferences, but with infrastructure. And hearing, or even seriously interviewing, a young, offense-first coach is one of the loudest ways an organization can show that kind of commitment. The logic is simple. If you believe your quarterback is part of the future, you don't hire a coach who needs him to fit into an old system. You hire someone who builds the system around him. Younger offensive minds are often more flexible, more collaborative, and more willing to tailor schemes to a quarterback's strengths instead of forcing adjustments that slow development. That's why fans see this as a Shedeur forward move. Nothing has been officially confirmed, and it's important to be clear about that. The Browns haven't said this interview is for Shedeur. But in the NFL, intent is often shown through patterns, not quotes. And Cleveland's recent pattern, moving away from rigid structures, prioritizing offense, and now interviewing a young coordinator, points in a very specific direction. It also suggests patience. Young quarterbacks don't usually thrive under coaches who are coaching for their resume or their last contract. They thrive under coaches who are growing alongside them, learning what works and adjusting in real time. That's what makes the Udinsky interview feel less like a gamble and more like a developmental bet. Of course, this cuts both ways. If Cleveland brings in a coach like this, it raises expectations for Shedeur immediately. There are no more built-in excuses. A modern offense, a flexible scheme, and a coach invested in quarterback growth means results matter. Shedeur wouldn't just be the guy with potential, he'd be the guy. And that's fair. What makes this moment important is that it signals clarity. For the first time, Cleveland's coaching search appears aligned with quarterback development instead of conflicting philosophies. That alone is a shift from past seasons where mixed signals created confusion and debate. This interview doesn't guarantee Shedeur's future, but it strongly suggests the Browns are finally asking the right question. Instead of "Can this quarterback survive our system?" they're asking what kind of system helps this quarterback succeed. And when an organization starts asking that question, it usually means they're ready to stop hedging and start building. Sometimes the clearest signal doesn't come from press releases or insiders, it comes from the fans. And the reaction to the Cleveland Browns interviewing Grant Udinski was immediate, loud, and revealing. This wasn't cautious optimism, it was urgency. Across social media, Browns fans weren't debating whether Udinski deserved an interview, they were begging the front office not to let him leave the building. That kind of reaction doesn't come from stat sheets or resumes, it comes from frustration, years of it. Frustration with recycled coaches, stale offenses, and systems that never seemed built for the players actually on the roster. What stood out most wasn't praise for Udinski's past success, it was relief. Fans zeroed in on his age, his energy, and his trajectory. They openly rejected the idea of another older coach with an outdated philosophy. Comments weren't subtle. "Don't let him out. Hire him immediately. This is exactly what we need." Those reactions say less about Udinski as an individual and more about what the fanbase is desperate to move away from. Cleveland fans have seen this movie before. They've watched young quarterbacks get forced into rigid systems. They've watched coordinators prioritize their scheme over player strengths, and they've watched seasons fall apart because the offense never evolved. So when a name like Udinski entered the conversation, fans didn't see a risk, they saw a reset. That's why this reaction matters. Fans aren't in the building, but they're not clueless either. They see patterns. They see trends around the league, and many of them recognize that the teams thriving right now aren't clinging to tradition, they're embracing adaptability. To them, Udinski represents that shift. There's also a deeper layer to the excitement. A lot of fans believe this interview confirms something they've been waiting to hear indirectly, that Cleveland is finally serious about offensive development and quarterback alignment. Whether that quarterback is Shedeur Sanders or not, the fanbase sees this as a move toward clarity instead of confusion. Of course, fan excitement doesn't win games, and front offices don't hire coaches based on trending comments, but public reaction still matters. It reflects trust or lack of it in the direction an organization is taking, and for once, the reaction wasn't divided. It was unified. That alone tells you how starved this fanbase is for change, not cosmetic change, philosophical change. And when fans respond this strongly to an interview, not even a hire, it suggests Cleveland isn't just evaluating a coach. They're finally aligning with what everyone has been asking for all along. What makes this interview process so interesting isn't just the names involved, it's the pattern forming behind them. And once you zoom out, it starts to look less like coincidence and more like a calculated shift led by Jimmy Haslam. Haslam hasn't been loud about it. There's been no press tour, no bold declarations about a new era. Instead, his strategy has played out through actions. And actions, especially at the ownership level, tend to reveal far more than words ever do. Start with what Cleveland has moved away from. The Browns are no longer prioritizing familiarity. They're not clinging to long-tenured coaches or recycled names with safe resumes. They're not insulating decisions with experience just to avoid criticism. Instead, they're interviewing younger, offense-oriented minds, coaches who represent growth, adaptability, and long-term alignment. That's not accidental. Owners don't greenlight interviews like Grant Udinski unless they're comfortable with risk. And Haslam has historically been cautious. That's what makes this shift so notable. It suggests he's learned something from past cycles, that stability without direction is just stagnation. Another key detail is timing. Haslam didn't wait for public pressure to force his hand. These moves came quickly, decisively, almost as if the organization already knew what it wanted to avoid repeating. That tells you internal evaluations had likely been happening long before the season ended. There's also a cultural element here. Haslam has been criticized in the past for being too hands-on then too hands-off. This moment feels different. Instead of micromanaging or disengaging, he's setting parameters. Youth, offense, development, alignment. Within those lanes, the football people can operate, but the lanes themselves are clearly defined. And that's where this ties back to the quarterback conversation. While Haslam hasn't publicly stated this is about Shedeur Sanders, it's hard to ignore how quarterback-friendly these decisions look. Young coach, modern offense, long runway. Those aren't traits you chase unless you believe your quarterback needs room to grow, not pressure to conform immediately. Of course, this approach isn't without risk. Young coaches fail, offenses stall, development doesn't always follow a straight line, but Haslam appears willing to accept that uncertainty in exchange for clarity. That's the real strategy here. Not guaranteeing success, but removing confusion. Not protecting the past, but investing in a future that can actually evolve. Jimmy Haslam isn't making flashy moves, he's making directional ones. And when an owner finally commits to a direction instead of hedging, it usually means the organization has stopped guessing and started building with intent. Every coaching search eventually reaches this crossroads: play it safe or take a swing. And by interviewing Grant Udinski, the Cleveland Browns are clearly leaning toward the swing. Because make no mistake, this is a risk. Udinski is young, he hasn't been a head coach before. He doesn't have decades of scars, press conferences, or playoff runs to point to, and in a league that still values experience as a security blanket, that alone makes some people uncomfortable. There's a reason many franchises default to familiar names. When things go wrong, experience gives cover. But that's only half the equation. The reward side is where this interview starts to make sense. Young offensive coaches don't come with rigid playbooks carved in stone. They come with ideas, flexibility, willingness to adapt week to week and player to player. That's the trade-off Cleveland appears willing to explore. Instead of asking, has this worked before, they're asking, can this grow into something better? That matters because Cleveland isn't in a position where safe automatically equals successful. Playing it safe hasn't delivered long-term answers at quarterback or on offense. And organizations stuck in the middle, not rebuilding, not contending, are often the ones that benefit most from calculated risk. This is where the quarterback conversation quietly returns. If the Browns believe Shedeur Sanders needs development more than discipline, then the reward of hearing a young, adaptable coach outweighs the risk of inexperience. A coach who grows with his quarterback can build trust faster than one trying to install a system on day one. Of course, the downside is real. Young coaches can get overwhelmed, they can struggle with game management, they can hit walls when adversity stacks up, and Cleveland has lived through enough failed experiments to know that upside doesn't always cash in. That's why this decision is so telling. It suggests the Browns aren't chasing instant validation anymore, they're chasing alignment. Alignment between coach, quarterback, and organizational timeline. And alignment often requires patience, something Cleveland hasn't always shown in the past. From an ownership perspective, this also signals confidence. Jimmy Haslam wouldn't greenlight a risk like this unless he believed the reward justified it. Not just wins, but stability built the right way. This isn't about finding the safest coach available. It's about deciding whether Cleveland wants to repeat familiar cycles or finally accept that real progress usually comes with discomfort first. Risk can fail, but avoiding it guarantees one thing: staying exactly where you are. And for the Browns, that may be the biggest risk of all. When you step back and look at the full picture, the interview with Grant Udinski isn't just another box checked in a long coaching search. It's a signal, and possibly the clearest one the Cleveland Browns have sent all offseason. This move tells us Cleveland isn't chasing comfort anymore. For years, the Browns leaned into familiar logic, proven names, rigid systems, and the idea that experience alone would stabilize the franchise. That approach brought moments of hope, but it never brought alignment. Now the pattern has changed. Younger candidates, offensive focus, flexibility over tradition. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens when ownership decides the old formula isn't enough. That's where Jimmy Haslam comes into the picture. Instead of making loud promises, Haslam has let the interview list do the talking. And what it's saying is simple: Cleveland wants to build forward, not backward. This isn't about chasing names that once worked somewhere else. It's about finding a coach who can grow with the roster that's already here. Naturally, that brings everything back to Shedeur Sanders. While nothing has been officially confirmed, the direction is hard to miss. Teams don't prioritize young, offense-minded coaches unless they believe their quarterback needs development, not replacement. They don't chase adaptability unless they're done forcing players into systems that don't fit. And they don't accept risk unless they believe the long-term payoff is worth short-term uncertainty. That doesn't mean Udinski will get the job. Interviews don't equal hires, but interviews do reveal intent, and Cleveland's intent looks different than it has in years. This offseason isn't about patching last season's problems. It's about correcting the philosophy that created them. It's about deciding whether the Browns want to keep surviving cycles or finally commit to one path long enough to see it through. Of course, risk remains. Young coaches fail, development stalls. Nothing is guaranteed in the NFL, but what is guaranteed is that repeating the same approach leads to the same results. And Cleveland appears ready to accept uncertainty in exchange for growth. So the real takeaway isn't about Grant Udinski. It's about clarity. The Browns are no longer hiding behind vague messaging or mixed signals. They're showing, not telling, what they value: offense, adaptability, and long-term quarterback development. Whether this gamble pays off or not will be decided on the field. But for the first time in a long time, Cleveland looks like a franchise that knows what it's building, not just hoping something sticks. And that alone makes this interview matter far more than it appears on the surface.